Welcome to Advanced Interpretive Training. This is looking at church growth and organizational intelligence. My name is Russ Crabtree. I'll be your presenter. It's intended to be an additional advanced training for folks who've already had the basic catwalk interpretive consultant training. My objectives are first to review the dominance of church growth as a priority for members. Secondly, to establish worship attendance as the preferred metric for church growth. Articulate the relationship between church growth and organizational climate in a congregation. And to do the same, articulate the relationship between church growth and organizational culture in a congregation. Demonstrate the relationship between changes in worship attendance and the intention of members to explore other churches in a pastoral transition, and to encourage interpretive consultants to integrate church growth information into their presentations. So let's begin by talking about the dominance of church growth priorities. As you know, there are 17 priorities that members are asked to respond to in the basic CAT, asking where they would like to see additional energy invested in the future. And of those 17, 2 of them directly speak to the need to prioritize church growth. One of them is a more general church growth priority around reaching new people, incorporating them into the life of the church. And the second is more specifically related to attracting families with children and youth. These priorities are overwhelmingly in the top 2 for most members of congregations. So reaching new members is the first or second priority for 92% of the churches in the Holy Cow Consulting database. And the more specific one about families, reaching families with children and youth, is the first or second priority for 72% of churches. So we can see that this is these 2 priorities are really concerns for almost all churches in the Holy Cow Consulting database. And yet in the basic catwalk training as it's been developed, there's not much said relating the various indices and metrics to church growth. So this is an attempt to provide some tools to interpretive consultants to make that integration happen as it seems appropriate. Now, worship attendance, we're saying here, is really the preferred metric related to church growth. And we actually have worship attendance data in the Vital Signs report. It's found on page 28. It comes from the church data form where whoever's administering the CAT administratively gathers data on the average Sunday attendance versus 1 year, 2 years, and 3 years earlier. So we really have 4 data points. The reason I think worship attendance is the preferred metric is, number one, it's an upstream metric. It anticipates gains and losses in membership that are going to occur maybe 1, 2, or 3 years later. And it also is more up to date. So often membership rolls are out of date significantly because leaders may not engage in an annual kind of discipline of updating those roles. It's kind of an arduous task. You have to get in touch with members and see if they want to stay on a roll or not. So worship attendance is really the better metric, and that's what we're going to be looking at specifically in the entire database over these 4 data points for churches in that database. Now, when we talk about organizational climate, we're generally referring to the energy satisfaction map. And as you know from the methodology, we look at energy and we look at satisfaction as really key kind of bottom line metrics of the climate within a congregation. You can see high energy at the top, low energy at the bottom, low satisfaction to the left, high satisfaction to the right. And you have the 4 quadrants: transformation, chaos, um, recovery or reinvention, and then static. Well, what we know from the research we've been able to do on these quadrants is that they have different characteristics or tendencies related to church growth as measured by worship attendance. So if we look at the chart, we see that there's really only one area of this particular map, the energy satisfaction map, that shows church growth at 2.8%. And that's up in the upper right-hand area or region of the transformation quadrant. When you drop below, even though you're in the transformation quadrant, but you drop more into a transition zone below those higher scores, you start seeing a decline of about 7%. If you drop down into the to the static quadrant, minus 5.2. The quadrant that shows the largest losses is actually the chaos quadrant, where you have energy with lower levels of satisfaction. It's probably because we often see folks who are really energized and in conflict. And that is not just a matter of low morale, but it's a matter of folks in conflict with one another about one issue or another, who care about it deeply, and so the satisfaction in the church takes a pretty big hit. So minus 22.8, and then after that, the lowest scores for declines in the worship attendance occur in this recovery or reinvention quadrant, minus 14%, but in the upper region of that, but the lowest region is almost 18%, minus 18%. So why is this important? Well, you can say to churches that if you want to grow your church, which most churches do, it really is in your interest to pay attention to the climate within the church, satisfaction and energy. And what are the areas that you focus on that can help with that? Well, often it's going to be areas listed in the critical success factor list found in the Vital Signs report. Now, we not only want to look at the relationship between climate and church growth, but we also want to understand what is the relationship between culture and church growth. And again, as you know, we look at organizational culture in two dimensions. We look at the flexibility within the church, and we look at the theological perspective. And you see the four quadrants performing: Magi, Paraclete, and Hearth and Home. Now, what we're going to focus on here in this analysis is not so much the theological perspective, but what happens at different levels of flexibility in terms of the tendency to. And what we see is that the churches that have the highest level of flexibility indicate that they are losing members, but only at a rate over that four data points of minus 2%. As the flexibility begins to drop, the loss in worship attendance, the tendency tends to drop as well. So you have minus 7%, minus 12%. At the lowest level of flexibility, minus 15%. So it's generally the case that the lower the flexibility within a church, the more likely it is to be losing worship attendance. Now, again, it's important to say that these are percentages based upon the tendency within the entire group. So there are going to be churches in each of these different regions that are going to be potentially growing, and churches that are losing worship attendance. But this gives you some sense of what you're kind of up against if you are in a less flexible system. So in the least flexible system, you're 7 times more likely to be losing members than in a system that is more flexible. Remember, we're just looking at flexibility here. We're not taking into account any other of the factors of morale as we start seeing higher energy levels and satisfaction among these more flexible systems, they start actually gaining members. So we're just looking at the one factor and its influence. So why is this important? Because we want to be able to say to churches that are in these lower levels of flexibility that if church growth is a priority to you, it is probably going to be in your interest to develop take additional steps to increase the flexibility, the missional flexibility or adaptability of the congregation. So that looks at climate and culture and its effect on church growth as measured by tendencies in churches of changing worship attendance. Now we want to look at a specific case for churches that are going through a pastoral transition. The transition module, as you know, is often added to the standard bank of questions in the church and assessment tool. And there are a number of questions there regarding the intentions of people related to the transition. One of those questions in particular has a direct impact on worship attendance. During the transition, I am thinking about exploring other churches. This bank of questions is found on page 89 in the, page 29 in the Vital Signs report. And what we want to know is how does the intention of members to explore other churches during a transition impact worship attendance? In other words, are we really measuring something here that has a real impact on the church? And when we run an analysis and looking at churches at different levels of folks indicating they're going to explore other churches, we get a pretty good picture of that. So here we have a graph showing the impact of that. So if we look at that question, or folks thinking about exploring other churches, as the score on that begins to increase, and these are percentile ranks, then the worship attendance losses also increase significantly. So when churches have a relatively low score on that question, under the 20th percentile, in terms of folks indicating they're going to explore other churches, there's a relative low level of loss that takes place in those churches that probably extends into the pastoral transition. When that is over the 80th percentile, lots of folks indicating they're going to explore other churches, that does indeed tend to reflect significant worship attendance losses. Now, when folks are entering into a pastoral transition and they begin to realize how important this score is and the effect that this could have on their worship attendance going into the future, they may ask, what are the factors that help people to stay in a church during pastoral transition? And they're basically three. The first is maintaining high energy and satisfaction in the church climate. That's not going to be a surprise. We've already seen that energy, from that energy satisfaction map, that those churches with high energy, high satisfaction are doing the best in terms of worship attendance. So maintaining that high energy, high level of satisfaction, and if necessary, working on that by paying attention to a number of things, including the critical success factors that are in the Vital Signs report. Secondly, a second protective factor is doing a good job managing and resolving conflict. We've been seeing this for years as I've done analysis of data working with churches in transition, that if churches are in conflict and not dealing with that conflict well, they're likely to bleed out members during a pastoral transition. So that's a protective factor if churches can do a good job managing and resolving conflict. And the third factor, again, that we've seen over the years that's pretty consistent for churches in transition is having leaders who are representative and in touch with the congregation. Remember, during a pastoral transition, the pastor has gone, retired or moved on elsewhere. And so what's left are the lay leaders. So that relationship to the lay leadership is absolutely critical during a pastoral transition. And leaders who are doing a good job helping people feel like they are in touch with them, listening to them, really becomes a protective factor during those transitions in terms of maintaining worship attendance. So the conclusions: church growth is a priority for the vast majority of congregations, and therefore can be helpful to address it as a part of a presentation. Organizational climate and culture have a significant impact on worship attendance trends, and they're fairly predictive as we look at congregations in terms of what's going to happen with worship attendance. So if churches are interested in growth in worship attendance, they need to pay attention to climate and culture. During a pastoral transition, the indication that members will explore other churches is a predictor of changes in worship attendance. That's important to note. High energy and satisfaction, flexibility, conflict resolution, positive leadership are critical factors for church growth as well. Finally, integrating church growth information into an interpretive session is consistent with leader interests and enriches the experience for them. So finding ways to take this information, not make it the major part of the interpretation, but using the information as you are talking about their priorities and how those priorities can be accomplished in terms of improving climate, shifting culture, and where necessary, talking about pastoral transitions can be helpful. For more information about this kind of research, check out Penguins in the Pews, a new book. It's about climate change and church growth. It's available through Amazon or the Holy Cow Consulting website.